This is Scott Spratt of ProFootballFocus.com Fantasy, and this is another Fantasy Slant. There were several interesting things that happened in Week 11, but the one that stood out the most to me was how many running backs got a lot of carries. There were actually 5 backs with at least 26 carries this week. That's the most backs to cross that threshold of any week so far this season. And weeks 2 and 3 were the only other weeks where more than 2 backs crossed that 26 carry threshold. So let's talk about some of those guys. Jonas Gray is the one that stands out the most. He took his 38 carries from the Patriots to 4 touchdowns and a dominant running back performance over the Colts on Sunday night. This is the same team that had LeGarrette Blount have 4 touchdowns in the playoffs last season, so you could just wish from a fantasy perspective that the Patriots were playing the Colts every week. However, they can't play the Colts every week, so down the stretch you're going to be plagued by the same inconsistencies. Both Gray and Shane Vereen are probably top 25 running backs the rest of the way, but in the fantasy playoffs it can be still difficult to rely on either player because those zeros that they occasionally give will end your fantasy season quickly. In Houston, Alfred Blue got 37 carries of his own. That's because Arian Foster was a late scratch to this game. You really need to handcuff Alfred Blue to Arian Foster if you haven't, if that's still an option at all. I would trade quite an asset for him because clearly Blue is the one that's going to get that work in Foster's absence. However, Blue is not the same type of dynamic player Foster is. For the season, Arian Foster has 2.99 yards after contact per attempt. That's the 3rd best among all qualified backs. Compare that to 2.16 yards after contact per attempt for Blue. That's only 33rd of 51 qualified runners. The workload means that Blue would be a top 10 back if Foster was out, but he isn't the top 3 player that Foster is when he's in the mix. The most interesting player here may be Tre Mason, who had 29 carries for the Rams. The interesting thing here is that he's clearly asserted himself as the lead back in St. Louis. He's actually had 14 or more carries in 4 of the last 5 games. So I think you can consider him to be a safe running back too, probably even in the top 15 the rest of the way this season. In Cincinnati, Gio Bernard missed another game, and that led to 27 more carries from Jeremy Hill. Hill has been great in fantasy with Bernard absent, but Bernard should be back next week or sometime soon, and that could lead to some frustration for owners. I tend to think that Bernard will reassert himself as the primary back here. As effective as Hill has been, 2.65 yards after contact per attempt, Bernard has been pretty much as effective this year, 2.67 yards after contact per attempt. Plus, Bernard does a lot of other things, like be dynamic in the passing game, that makes him a more versatile player. So I'd say 60% of the workload to Bernard going forward and most of the passing work. That'll make him a safe but low-end top 10 player at the position. Finally, I'm going to cheat a little bit here because Mark Ingram didn't quite pass the 26 carry threshold. He had just 23 carries, still quite a bit, and in keeping with the production that he's been showing a lot lately. But Ingram also had 7 catches in this game. And it seems weird. I mean, he had only had 35 catches in 3.5 years of his career, but that was on 7 targets, and he had 5 targets in Week 10 as well. With Pierre Thomas out, who led all backs with 77 catches last year, I think Ingram is actually doing a little bit of work as a receiver. I think you can expect 2 or 3 catches a week. That might make him a top 5 running back the rest of the way, assuming especially that Pierre Thomas and Kyrie Robinson can't come back and reestablish their earlier positions with the team. Ingram has become a dynamic player at the position, and so he's a great player to have on your roster as the fantasy playoffs approach. For Pro Football Focus, this is Scott Spratt.